Now here's a question that might initially seem stupid to ask, and one that you probably haven't put too much thought in once you kind of fell into a certain category that gave you an answer. And that question is, why does every single ancient culture have some form of a creation myth? Why is it that every ancient culture that we look at that has survived, essentially till now, at least their stories have sort of survived until now, why is it that they all, for some reason, have a creation myth? Now, before you shut this video off in pure disgust, because you think that the answer is already known, regardless of which side of the academic / historical / scientific spectrum you come from, and by that I mean whether you're like a hardcore, atheist type of person, or you're a hardcore religious type of person, right? Or anywhere in between. Everyone in this spectrum generally feels that they already know the answer. Now, I get it. It's not everybody who feels they know the answer, but I would argue that the vast majority of people on this planet, if they were to be asked the question, where did humans come from, right? They would have some sort of an answer, whether it's an evolutionist talking about, how we came from amoebas and monkeys, or if it's a religious person who's talking about how some, mystical dude created things and now we're all running around scratching ourselves. There's an answer. And I don't think that most people appreciate the fact that humans, for some weird reason, have this hubris built into them that they know the answer from where they came from. Now, before I go further, why am I talking about this? Why am I even bringing this up? All right, so, this channel is dedicated to looking at history and trying to put together real history with the real evidence that we have. And of course, pointing out when we don't have evidence for something. It's just as important to go and grab the real evidence as it is to acknowledge the evidence that we are missing. And please absolutely believe that we are missing so much evidence for pretty much everything in our historical timeline that it's insane. So people who make a claim that they have an answer to something, more often than not, are probably spewing garbage. Just absolute lies or half-truths. And that's what we find in history. Now, the reason why I bring up the creation situation is because, for some weird reason, humans, not only right now, but humans all throughout time, feel that they have had a grasp on where they come from, on where all of this started. Now, that is one hell of a claim, right? To be able to say beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is where it all started and then presented. Right? And it's not just today that we do this. This has been done as long as humans have essentially existed. Now, you might be about to shut this off again thinking, well, yeah, no kidding. Humans are dumb. They'll make stuff up and they'll make up answers for themselves, right? But we won't do that today, right? All the answers today are right, but not the ones back in the day. Okay, we'll get to that in a second. But here's the deal. Here's the reality. No matter how far you go back in human history, we find that all of our ancestors, apparently, had it all figured out even back then, right? We don't know of a time historically when any of our ancestors did not have some form of a creation story, a creation myth, or a creation idea. It's not even a myth or an idea. To those people back in the day, we have no reason to believe that they thought it was a myth or a legend or whatever work of fiction, right? The stories were real to these people. This was their legitimate history, which begs the question, why do we no longer take that stuff as legitimate history? Now, so far, everything I've said, I'm sure you already have the answer locked and loaded to shove right in my face to show me how right you are and how stupid I am. I guarantee you, there's probably a part of you that's doing that, but give me a second, okay? If we approach this problem objectively using our critical thinking skills and basic common sense, suddenly the question becomes extremely interesting. I'll just say that. Suddenly the question of why do all of our ancestors have some form of a creation story, and to make matters even weirder, all of our ancestors that were, scattered all over the planet, for some weird reason, all of their creation stories are weirdly similar. All right. So what does all this mean? Why am I even bringing this up? Well, here's the problem. With humans, there is no reason for humans to create a creation story for themselves. And I guess I should say there is no scientific reason why humans all over the planet decided to create creation stories for themselves. Not only that, but there's also no scientific reason why humans would have created extraordinarily similar creation stories to what they have. So this begs the question, why do all of our ancient cultures that we find all over the world, why do they all have some sort of an origin idea? Like, what's going on here? So this is important to ask because there is no reason for anyone to do this. Right? There is no scientific genetic evidence that supports a reason that demands that humans in the past have to create some sort of an origin situation for them to, carry on or whatever, right? There is, from an evolutionary standpoint, there's no reason to do this, right? You having a creation story, you creating something like that, or trying to find one, or extrapolating one, or whatever, does nothing for you to help you survive evolutionary, right? I mean, you can't, if you're about to get mauled by a bear and you start quoting evolution statistics, right, that bear's gonna eat you and you die and your line is done, right? You no longer evolve if you take an evolutionist standpoint, right? Nature does not give a crap about your creation myth. It just doesn't care, right? If chipmunks want to eat you, if they want to gnaw your skull off, right, you cannot stop them and be like, oh, wait a second, chipmunks. You can't eat me because we evolved from amoebas, and then amoebas turned into monkeys, and then monkeys turned into me, right? The chipmunks do not care. Nature is going to devour you. Those chipmunks are going to eat your eyeballs for dinner. They do not care. So if you're one of those people who, if I asked this question to you and you would have just said something to the tune of, well, all humans do it because humans have, evolved an imagination and it's a natural thing for humans to wonder at where they came from. That's garbage. We have no proof whatsoever that any human on the planet is genetically, scientifically predisposed to create some form of a creation myth. It doesn't need to exist, right? There's no evolutionary gain from creating, evolution, right? That nobody cares. Nature does not give a crap if you believe in evolution or not, all right? So from an evolutionary standpoint, if you're on that far side of the spectrum and you think the answer to why did everybody create a creation myth is simply because it's in human nature to want to understand, their past, that's false, that's wrong. Right? And that might sound weird, but it's true. We have zero evidence anywhere that scientifically, unequivocally proves that it is required for a human on the scientific evolutionary side of things to come up with some form of a creation myth. So if you're on that side of the argument that would just answer, well, humans would have just imagined it, that is a possibility, but that is not a scientific fact that they had to. Now, this observation leaves us in a very peculiar situation if you're on that side of the scientific evolutionary side of things. Because the question is valid. Why is it that all of our ancient ancestors came up with some sort of creation myth? And of course, even worse, they're all very similar. Now, I just said all of that because I wanted to make a point that if you are on the more scientific side of things, you believe in evolution, etc., and you believe that the concept of creation myths are ridiculous, the reality is, at the end of the day, you do not have a real scientific answer as to why all of our ancestors created these creation mythologies. Why did they have these in their histories? And they all have them. That's the other thing. That's a scientific bullet point. Everybody has it. So if you are on that side of things, that scientific side of things, you have to admit to yourself right now, if you're being completely objective, that we really do not understand why humans back in the day created a creation myth. Now, I've been beating up on evolutionists and science people. Let me go to the other side of the spectrum now. Let's go slap around religious people. Same principles hold true for the religious people. right? So religious people just believe, hey, it's the God that created it, or the Mother Earth, or whatever mythology that they, that they partake in right now, and they're happy with that answer, and it is, of course, unfalsifiable. That's one of the problems with religious, claims and studies, is there's nothing we can do that I'm aware of that can falsify like all of those myths, right? And there's an entire religious industry built up around, or a scientific industry, I should say, built up around the fact that, people are trying to scientifically prove the creation happened, etc., right? And then creationists, Abrahamic creationists, they fall into the trap of believing all the current mainstream garbage with respect to relativity and string theory, and all the garbage cosmology, and makes themselves worse. But they're so desperate to prove where their mythology comes from, the religious dogma comes from, that they'll grasp at anything, okay, I'm babbling. So anyway, the religious side falls into the same pitfalls as like the evolutionary side when it comes to trying to explain why people believe that they know what happened back in the day, right? Like why all of our ancestors had a really good understanding of where they came from, and of where, the universe came from, and creation and all of that, right? Religious people are screwed just as much as the hardcore scientific people, with the main difference being that the religious person will say that, the gods handed down the creation situation to the humans, right? Humans were technically there for the creation. That's kind of the way the stories are sort of told in a lot of religious texts and stuff like that. Humans witness the creation, or they appear and they know of it, and they get told of it either by the god figure, or they're in it while it's happening, right? They witness it and they carry that on. Now, the interesting thing about the religious side of this question is that they might be closer to the truth than the scientific atheist side. Now, why do I say that? Well, let's look at this. So we've already established that there's no scientific reason for a human to go out of their way to create a creation myth. It doesn't technically help anybody. I mean, so for example, also on the religious side of things, even if you didn't know your creation, like you could still believe in God and have no idea how you were created. There's no reason for you to need to know that, right? You could still go on pretty much doing all of your religious stuff. Doesn't matter the religion. If your religion preaches, creationism of some sort, which they all do. I mean, they all have their explanation, right? You don't need to know that to worship the religion generally. In fact, I don't think there's a single religion that you could not still be successful at. Even if a creation story never existed, you would still be fine. You could still practice your religion. So what this tells us, what all this garbage is that I've been talking about, what this points out, and obviously this is a quick overview, but I just wanted to make the point really fast that regardless on whatever side of the spectrum you are on, the question still stands. Why is it that all of our ancestors have a similar creation myth? Now, we can go a little deeper with this, of course, as well, right? The religious side can say, well, there's only one true God, or gods, or whatever, however you want to interpret that, and they deliver the message, right? So the God or the gods deliver the message. There you go. We have it now. And of course, everybody got it because, the gods are gods, and all God, the gods or the God deal with humans in general, so everybody would have it. So that's how a religious person can brush off this question, and they do, and they will. And then, of course, on the other side, if you want to really poke around the scientific side, you can say that you can try to make the case that there's like these archetypes built into the human conscious or psyche or whatever you want to do with that. But and what an archetype would be something like a natural fear of night, or a natural desire to, draw dogs or something. I don't know. You would have a natural predisposition to, fearing certain things, or wanting to. There are themes for some weird reason embedded into humans, and then humans will react naturally off of those archetypes, embedded in the conscious or the subconscious, or whatever, weird stuff you want to talk about there. That's that's the best science kind of has for that. And then, of course, they all hope and pray that one day maybe in genetics they'll prove that those archetypes exist, right? That's kind of like the hope on that side of things. Now, that is pushing it, And it's not acceptable. Neither side is acceptable. We can't do that, right? The religious side is unfalsifiable, and the scientific side, the quote unquote scientific side with the archetypal, thing, that's just crazy. I mean, it's insane, but people take this as if it's okay, right? They accept it as if, well, we'll figure it out later, but that's got to be the answer. I mean, obviously it's the answer. We have figured it all out. This is the answer. It's not the answer. We don't know. So if we don't know why all of our ancestors decided to randomly come up with a creation myth, we now have found ourselves a serious problem. This is an issue, because why is it that at a certain point in history, all about the same time, suddenly all of our ancestors start coming out with creation stories that are all very similar to one another? Why did this happen? What's going on here in history that suddenly ignited humans to magically start recording history in a very specific way, to describe it in a very similar way as to their friends on the other side of the planet? This is an issue that is never discussed in history, or at least I don't see it. Nobody brings this up. This is a fundamental problem with our historical studies, and people hand wave it away. The reason why people hand wave it away is because it is difficult, and because the reality is there's no answer. But is there? Let's have some fun. Let's apply our critical thinking and our common sense capabilities to the problem of why all of our ancestors created creation stories. So right now we have the question. Now let's start digging into it. Let's start going over the basics and let's see what we can figure out. Is there some direction that we can come out of this with that might provide us a good direction for a real answer in our historical studies? This is important because, especially if you're an ancient researcher, but, really any historical researcher would benefit from this. But we have to deal with the fact that the ancients, they all had these mythologies, and you can't ignore them, right? Mainstream ignores them because they throw them into the world of fiction or euphemisms or whatever, right? There's all kinds of cope on the side of the scientific, and then of course the religious. If the religious side, it's not their religion, then it's blasphemy, and then they don't listen to it, and whatever. So both sides are equally guilty and equally need to be slapped around. I mean, just straight up need to be just choked out, right? Okay, so let's get to the point, right? It's taking like 20 minutes to get here. Let's start getting to the point. So the first observation that we can make when we start looking back is that we do indeed find all of these creation myths have a similar foundation. Now, this is weird, mainly for scientific people, not so weird for the religious side. But if we're in the middle, and we're going to be in the middle, it's weird, right? Because these creation stories are 5, 6, 7, 8 thousand-ish or so years old. The year is another problem, and I don't have an answer for that, by the way. But the main creation stories are not 100,000 years old. That's one thing to remember. These are not 200,000 years old or 1,000,000 years old. They are relatively recent. They're relatively recent. They're only it's only thousands of years ago, right? So at some point in time, for whatever reason, everybody starts coming up with a creation story, right? So, and they all come up with this story right around the same time. Now, this is an important bullet point to make out here, because if we have humans all over the planet saying and recording the exact same thing, that is valuable. Why is that valuable? Okay, well, so the religious side will instantly just say, well, it just proves God. God talked to everybody. And the religious side is done. So I'm not going to focus too much on the religious side, because the religious side of this conversation, they have the best hand-waving method that they can have, and that's, God. God said some shit. And since God is not understandable to a human, there's no reason to try to explain it, because it's God. It's God. Come on, man. It's God. He's got it covered. So we're not going to deal too much with the religious side, because at the end of the day, that's what they can fall back on once you start to poke a lot of holes into their arguments. Now, the scientific side is just as bad, but we're going to use those tools because the scientific tools are the ones we should be using, that the people who are on the scientific side claim to be using, but never actually use them, right? Okay, all right, so let's do this. So if everybody is recording something at around the exact same time, and all of this stuff is similar, what can we infer from this? All right, so let's back up for a second. Where do humans live? All right, we live on Earth. What is Earth? Earth is a planet in space. All right, this is key. So that means that every time a human looks up into the sky, everybody can see space, right? It doesn't matter where you are on the planet, there is one commonality that all humans would share, and that would be the sky. If something happened up in the sky, you could see it, and everybody would see it. It wouldn't matter where you are, right? Unless it's a cloudy day, you have a full screen TV up there ready to show you, and the entire planet what's going on. So when we start to look at why all of these people are recording the exact same story, we can think of diffusion, we can. But the problem with diffusion, well, there's all kinds of scientific problems with diffusion, which is why I didn't even really necessarily want to bring it up. But since I'm talking to myself and nobody listens to this crap, I'm just going to bring it up really quick and put it to the side. The diffusion argument is something that historians and scientists can try to inject into this problem. You can say that, oh, well, hey, someone came up with a story, and from there, people liked it, and it kind of slowly diffused over the world as humans migrated. Now, there's a lot of problems with that from the scientific perspective, because then, scientists and historians, to one degree, now have to admit that, ancient civilizations were global, right? It's something that the mainstream really has a difficult time with, because then they have to admit that certain levels of technology had to have existed to be a global civilization, would have had to have been there, and then, but our history books say that stuff was not there. And so diffusion is a weird excuse, and I don't think it's used too often. I don't want to say too often. I mean, it's used, but it's a point of contention even in the mainstream historical and scientific communities, because, someone's got to admit they're wrong there, right? To make the diffusion case even worse is that we also do not have a good grasp of the timeline with respect to technological progress, right? Because we have times in history to where humans literally start at the very top of technological achievement and then slowly degrade, right? So you have Egypt, for example, who they just out of nowhere are building pyramids, and then they slowly decline. Now, I realize the mainstream tries to make it sound like, the Red Pyramid and then the Bent Pyramid, and then eventually they got to the Great Pyramid, but there's zero evidence for that, right? I mean, these pyramids, they just appear, and then civilization declines from there. So that's a whole other story. But because we do not have any solid proof of the evolution of our technological capabilities throughout history all over the world, we don't have this, diffusion gets a little weird. So we can kind of rule out diffusion. Now, where you can keep diffusion in is later on throughout history, when the world does start to mix up a little bit and everybody does start to talk here and there. That does happen. But I'm not talking about that period of time. I'm talking about the very beginning. I'm talking about the time when humans were there during creation or had just been created and the story begins, right? So if we get rid of diffusion, what are we left with? Well, as I was just starting to talk before I went the diffusion route, the reality is the next major thing that we can factually look towards, and I mean no arguments, there's nothing. This is a 100% fact, is that we can look to the sky. Everybody would have had a view of the sky and of space. Now, this is where things could get interesting. So if we are willing to get rid of the religious, metaphysical, whatever side of things, and then we are also willing to get rid of, we're not willing, we need to get rid of all the scientific side of things, all of their theories and ideas, because they're substantiated by absolutely nothing. If we just use our basic common sense and critical thinking, we have the sky. I mean, that is literally all we are left with. I know there's some of you out there that can say, like, aliens were zipping around and maybe telling people, or maybe there was an ancient internet, or God knows what crazy stuff is out there. What I'm talking about right now is we can only use what we can factually point to. right? And so the things I just mentioned, I don't have any proof of that right now. But what we do have is proof of is that the sky was visible to everybody. Given that the sky was visible to everybody, is it possible that aspects of their creation stories could have been influenced by some sort of cosmological event that took place in Earth's past? Right? Is that a possibility? And of course, the answer scientifically is yeah, of course. Why not, right? I mean, part of the creation myth that all of our cultures have, all the ancient cultures have, a lot of stuff takes place in the sky, right? And then, so you have stuff going on in the sky, and then, humans and everything else is created on Earth, and of course, Earth is also created. The stories are very cosmological, right at the core of their very being. And I don't think that's appreciated enough at all on either side of the spectrum when you go to start to study ancient cultures and ancient histories. Isn't that interesting? One of the main themes that all of these histories have is that something is going on in the sky, right? The gods are doing something in the sky. So what we can extrapolate from this, if just by using common sense and asking basic questions, is it possible the cosmological events influenced the creation myths of our ancestors? And I say influenced, but the reality is, were our ancestors not merely writing myths and legends and fictional stories, loosely based on some sort of event, but were they quite literally recording what they saw? All right. So when they start talking about the creation of the earth and what God births it and then where life comes from, is it possible that they watched some sort of cosmological event take place that essentially made all this stuff happen? Now, by making all of this stuff happen, I'm not talking about the creation of humans. That'll be another whole schizo, whatever the hell I do on my own. But so for this one, we'll stick to the creation of planet Earth, right? Or at least, let's have some more fun. Basically, existence, because that's where it all starts. The humans are not created first, then the planet, right? The existence is created first, then, life and all that stuff after it. So we'll focus on the planet. I was going to go talk about humans or whatever, but I'm running too low on time. So using critical thinking and just asking basic questions has led us to a really good possible conclusion. And that is, it is extraordinarily possible that everybody on planet Earth during a certain period of time, only 10,000-ish years ago or so, maybe a little sooner. That's, I don't have an exact date, but the date is not too far away when something incredible happened to where humans decided to all of a sudden start writing about these amazing things going on, right? That all of these elaborate stories all suddenly show up on the scene at the exact same time. So with all of that said, we can legitimately, scientifically make the claim that it is highly possible, if not probable, that all of our ancestors saw some incredible cosmological events that changed Earth to its core. And not only changed Earth, the face of Earth, and God knows what else on Earth, but also the planets and the solar system, right? Our ancestors may have actually witnessed and survived, to some degree, some extraordinary events not too long ago, because these stories only pop up, 3, 5, 6, 7,000 years ago or so, right? Maybe 10. Yeah, dating is weird. I don't have a date, and I'm not claiming a date, but the reality is these cosmological events did not take place millions of years ago, certainly not billions of years ago. They took place during a time in almost living memory for humans. Right? The only reason why people don't think about it like this nowadays is because everything in our history is thrown way back in time by the mainstream, right? Like everything takes place millions and billions of years ago. And over the decades of hearing this, right, we've all been preconditioned to no longer understand that cosmological events, of course, could have taken place just 1,000 years ago. There's literally nothing unscientific about that claim. What's even more crazy is that our ancestors recorded it, and we have those records in our hands now. The only problem that we suffer is that we are not listening to what they are saying. So from here on out, whenever our ancestors make a claim that something happened in the sky, instead of just throwing it away as if it's fiction, Look at it from a scientific, cosmological perspective and see if you can line that up with something that actually could happen. Even better, throw away mainstream chronology or cosmology. Both. Throw both away. But once you get rid of mainstream scientific cosmology and use real scientific cosmology, that would be plasma physics, electric universe, etc. Once you start to incorporate that kind of real science, suddenly all of this stuff that our ancestors said and recorded, they start to make sense and they start to become real. And this stuff did not happen all that long ago. So with respect to the creation and why it's there because our ancestors witnessed it. That's it. That's the answer. Our ancestors wrote about this stuff because they all experienced it. Right? And they recorded it in their own way. And of course, the translations have been screwed up throughout time, etc., etc. But what has survived at the core, right? That's the truth. And that's what we need to start paying attention to.